All right, here we go with part number numero cuatro for our video lecture for chapter 15. And now we're going to focus on some of the economic changes and influence that we see Europe develop during the early modern era of 1415 to 1715. So let's talk about mercantilism. What is mercantilism? It is an economic system or economic theory, and it is based on the accumulation of wealth. What does that mean exactly? Well, the idea was, the main idea that the European countries started developing is this idea of developing and growing your wealth. And the more wealth a country has, the more power it will be able to exert, more influence it would have around the world. And how do you measure wealth is based on the amount of gold and silver that you have in your treasury. So the more gold and silver you have, the better. And so the goal is that the countries, the governments, the states have to take on policies that will maximize the profit for the country, not necessarily for the individuals, but for the country, right? For the state. And the idea is that another big part of it is that you don't want to buy stuff from other countries. Because if you have to buy all your shipbuilding materials from another country, then you're going to be giving them your gold and silver, and you're going to lose power while they gain it. So it is a competitive economic theory, right? Every country is out on its own. Every state has to attempt to increase the wealth as much as possible. So the way to increase it is to control your exports and your imports. The government is going to restrict what you can purchase. They're going to set the prices of the goods, and they're going to tell you from where you can purchase. So some famous examples of mercantile laws were those that the English government had set on its American colonies in North America. If you recall from American history, remember how there was like the Sugar Act and the Tea Act, all right, where the colonists in North America had to purchase their goods only from the English. They couldn't purchase it from anyone else, and at the price that the English government set. So this is a mercantile legal example. So it also limits as to what you can sell. So, for example, if I'm selling sugar because I own a sugar plantation, I want to sell sugar to the person who's going to purchase it at the highest possible price, right? To maximize my own personal profit. But the government under mercantilism, the state may tell me, no, you cannot sell it at a high price. You have to lower your price. Yet they control what is being purchased, they control what is being sold. So that means that the government has direct control over the economy, and that is mercantilism. Now, most of the nation states of Europe, France, England, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, right, they're going to adopt mercantilism. Some are, especially the absolute monarchies, they're going to rely on mercantilism because, again, that is giving absolute power to the state, to the ruler. The English and the Dutch, they're going to have kind of a blended economic system where they're going to blend mercantilism with capitalism. So mercantilism also supported by colonial expansion. So imagine you have a country with 100 workers, right? And they can produce 100 units. There's only so many times that they can produce those units and sell them, right? Because there's only a limited amount of units that a country is able to sell, right? But if you go and you conquer another territory, right? Instead of only selling 100 units, now you can sell 200 units because you have two territories to sell them to. So, in other words, you have a new market. So, the more markets you have through colonial conquest, right, the more power you have in your economy, the greater mercantilism will work. Also, the more territories you take over, the more resources you can take from those territories, whether those resources are like natural resources like gold, silver, oil, coal, iron, right? Or labor, right? Forcing the people you conquered to work for you as slaves. So mercantilism and colonial expansion that we're going to see during the early modern era, those two policies go hand in hand, right? And it's all about the mother country, right? The colonies provide stuff, whether it's materials, food, gold, and silver, and the mother country sits down at a banquet and gets to eat all this good stuff and expand bigger and bigger, while the colonies, are fully dependent on all this, fully dependent on the mother country, and the mother country is kind of taking advantage or abusing it. So then, in this time, especially by the mid 1700s, we have this guy Adam Smith come around. He's a Scottish guy, and he writes a book, and he is called "The Wealth of Nations." And he is examining the mercantile policies, and he says that mercantilism isn't all that great because you're putting limits on people, and the government is the one putting limits. And is also putting limits on motivation to keep working harder, because if you work harder under mercantilism, you're personally not going to benefit, but rather the state will benefit. So he says that instead of having a trade network that is controlled directly by the state, they should have free trade in a free market system, meaning that anyone can buy anything from anyone and at whatever price is agreeable by both the buyer and the seller, right? And you can sell anything to anyone at whatever price is agreeable between the buyer and the seller. And this free market, right? The government should have no say in it. The government has no interference in it because it is between a private citizen and another private citizen. The government shouldn't get involved. And by with this system, right, people will be able to work harder, because if I'm a shoemaker, right, I make shoes. That's my living, right? And I could sell my shoes at $100 a piece, right? And and the more I sell, the more profit goes in my pocket. The more workers I can hire, the bigger workshop I can purchase, right? The more materials I can purchase to make more shoes and sell them at $100 a piece. So I'm going to be motivated to keep working hard and building my business, right? Out of self-interest, my profit line, right? Because the profits are going to go to me. The profits of my business will go to me, right? So Smith says that when the government gets involved and puts limits on these transactions of buying and selling things, right, it's going to put limits on the amount of profit a person can make, a private, citizen can make, and therefore it's going to limit economic growth. When you have no limits, when anyone can purchase anything to any time, then that's great, right? Because everyone is going to want to buy stuff, everyone's going to sell stuff, and the economy is going to grow naturally. So that's what Smith is arguing in his book, right? And what determines price, right, is supply and demand, the law of supply and demand, right? It's an economic theory created by Adam Smith. And he says that when there's a lot of lots of goods, I mean, but not enough demand, then the price has to drop, right? So let's say I have 100 shoes to sell, but in the town that I live in the city that I live in, I only have 20 customers. Now I can keep charging $100 per shoe, but chances are those 20 customers are not going to buy those shoes. They're going to look for a cheaper alternative. So, and that means that because there's not enough demand and I have too much supply, I'm going to have to lower my price. Now, the reverse is also true. And we see this in world history when it comes to stuff like sugar and tobacco, right? And cotton, where there's going to be an extreme demand. People are going to get addicted to these goods, these luxury goods, and there's not going to be enough supply. So they're going to cost a whole bunch of money. Kind of like how spices, right, coming from Asia, coming from India and China, right, going through the Ottomans, going through the Italians, by the time those spices get to the rest of Europe, those prices are going to be super high because there's going to be a demand and the supply is going to be limited. So Adam Smith says the government shouldn't get involved, that the free market regulates itself with the law of supply and demand, and capitalism is beneficial for most people, right? So that's what Adam Smith is going to argue. And so we're going to see that during this time, kind of the first forms of what we call capitalism is created. And its birthplace is going to be in England and the Netherlands. Now, before we get into capitalism, of course, we should know that population growth and urbanization, right? These two kind of go hand in hand. When you have food surplus, you're going to have population growth, and we're going to see more and more people moving to cities. And the food growth or the food crop increase is going to come from the New World. It's going to come from the Americas because there are going to be new crops like rice, sorry, not rice, potato and corn and tomatoes and peppers, and all these new crops are going to go from the Americas to Europe, to Africa, to Asia. And the population of Europe and Africa and Asia are going to grow, right, tremendously because of this new food variety, these better diets. And again, population and urbanization follow soon. So, economic capitalism, right? The first type of capitalism we see is where the private people, private owners, private businesses, private companies, private individuals are the ones who control the trade, not the state, right? Private entities. And uh, the first kind of, again, the first types of capitalism that we see are going to be formed in Europe and the Netherlands with the Dutch, right? And it is no surprise that at the same time that capitalism is gaining momentum there, we're going to see a commercial revolution. That means that the way you do business is going to change. And again, this is happening in the 14, 15, 1600s. Now, one of those new ways is the invention of this idea called the joint stock company. So, joint stock means that multiple people join together to purchase stock or invest in a company. So they're purchasing a part of the company. So like right now, if you go to Wall Street and you purchase stock in Apple, right, you're gonna earn a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of the company Apple. That's what you own, right? When you purchase stock, you own a tiny bit of the company. So joint stock company becomes this new idea. At the same time, we see stock exchange, where people can go and purchase and sell stocks, new banking systems, new banking practices of lending money with interest and stuff like that. All of these things wouldn't have existed in the medieval period, right? In the post-classical era of Europe. But the commercial revolution starts changing these things, right? Especially with the joint stock company. So capitalism is also going to look for the cheapest way to produce goods. And that is, of course, using slave labor, right? And stealing natural resources. So just like we mentioned that mercantilism led to colonization and expansion and conquest, so does capitalism. Because a capitalist wants to pay their workers as little as possible, like a slave would get paid nothing, for example, so that they can produce goods as cheaply as possible so that they could sell them and make the most amount of profit. So the commercial revolution takes place in Europe. Again, England and Netherlands are going to be the center place. And we see that there's going to be massive economic growth in those two countries, and it'll spread to the rest of the continent. Now, around this time, we see the first what we call industries take hold in Europe. And an industry is basically a company that's job is to produce goods, right? So we will call it the cottage industry or the putting out system. So basically, in the past, you had these peasants living in the farmlands, living in the rural areas, and they would be mainly self-sufficient. They'll produce the goods that they need for their own personal survival, and that's about it. And in the cities and the towns, you would have craft guilds, right, producing goods for export, producing goods for local consumption, like shoes and clothing, and iron tools and weapons, like blacksmith stuff. So what starts happening is some people realize that it's cheaper if I go And if I'm a cloth merchant, right, I buy and I sell clothing, and so I can make the clothing myself, which takes a long time, and then sell it. And as a result, because of the amount of time it takes, sell it at a high price. Or I can get someone else to make it for me and then pay them a wage, right? They earn a living, and then sell it at a cheaper price and, outbid my competitors, right? Have a cheaper price than my competitors. And that's what exactly starts happening in Europe. This putting out system, the merchants, they go into the farmlands, into the rural areas, and they start hiring peasants. And they tell the peasants, look, I know you work 24/7, maintaining your farm and your house and your crops. But when you have the spare time, go ahead and weave this clothing for me. Here's the cloth, here's the needles, here are the materials, and I'll be back in about a month and I'll pick up whatever you have. And based on what you make, I'll give you a price, I'll give you money, right? And the peasants, of course, agree because any cash they can make on the side is always good. So we start seeing this kind of relationship form between workers who produce goods, they give it to the employer, right, the owner, and then the owner sells it and makes a profit. So the peasants are not, making profit themselves. They're earning a wage. They're free laborers. They're wage laborers, right? They're working for someone and they're getting paid to do a job, right? So that idea didn't exist before, because before, the peasants worked for a lord and they didn't own anything, right? Or the craft people, were in guilds and they made their own, they produced their own goods. But now you have this mixture of business owners and employees working together to produce goods, right? And as a result of the commercial revolution, as a result of capitalism, as a result of increased economic, um, like ability of Europe, we see the living conditions improve. People get to live longer. They get to buy nicer clothes. They get to buy furniture for their house, right? And enjoy some of the finer things in life. So even though, of course, some people became super, super, super rich, right, which is always the case, right? Generally speaking, overall, we see improved living conditions for Europe's poor. Now, where we don't see this is in Eastern Europe, and we don't see it in Russia either. And the reason is because they never really move away from the feudal system. They continue practicing serfdom, and therefore the peasants are never able to move up and become free laborers. And therefore they kind of get stuck in that economic feudal system of the Middle Ages. So Russia and Eastern Europe kind of stay behind, while Western Europe kind of progresses and moves forward with this. Now, as Europe becomes richer and there's more profit to be made, right? A lot of questions are being raised about what do you do with this wealth, right? Because now people are working hard not because, out of the goodness of their heart or because it is beneficial to their Lord. Now they're making working hard for their own personal profit, and that kind of goes against a lot of the Christian values that Europe has had for hundreds of years, dating back to the Middle Ages, where making profit was always viewed as something greedy, right? Like it's greedy and selfish, and it's not like religious, it's not spiritual. But now the ideas start changing, and we see that in Europe, the mentality changes. Where making profits is not seen as greedy or selfish; it's seen as smart, right? And we kind of link it back to that Protestant work ethic that the Protestants are supporting, where you work hard to prove that you're worthy of God's, salvation. So, um, so capitalism is going to bring these big social changes, right? More people are able to move up in society, right? People are going to start questioning more and more of those old traditional values that they've had for hundreds of years, and people are going to look for personal well-being, for personal profit. Now, within this huge multicultural, multilinguistic world of Europe, there's going to be small pockets of Jews living there, right? And these Jews have been living there for centuries. And sometimes they move around, sometimes they settle in one place for a very long time. And the point is that these Jewish communities, they tend to be isolated from the rest of the Christian communities in the sense that they work together and they work for themselves. So whenever in the Middle Ages, whenever you needed someone to lend you money, you would go to the Jews because it was forbidden for Christians to lend money and ask for a percentage, ask for interest. So the Jews have been working in financing for years, years, and years, and they've been using that wealth that they built up to educate themselves. So we see a lot of highly educated people in medicine and science and law working, and these are all Jewish people. So when you see the rest of Europe look at these Jewish communities, and they tend to be well-being, well off. They tend to take care of each other and work together because they have that shared cultural religious values, right? They're Jewish. Um, then we see the persecutions. We see how the Europeans are going to say, why is it these Jews always have this wealth? They must be doing something wrong. So we see a lot of persecutions against them, right? Going back to the Crusades, going back to the Black Death, right? Where Jewish minority groups are always going to be persecuted because they're an easy target, because again, they're a tiny percentage of the population. So the places where religion has a strong influence, where Christianity runs, wild, I guess, is where we see the least amount of tolerance. Spain, remember in Spain after the Reconquista, they completely banished all the Jews. They kicked them out of their country, and anyone who stayed behind would have been, facing charges with the Inquisition. The same thing is going to happen in Russia, right? When Russia comes to power, they're going to try to eliminate the Jews and kick them out of their country because they don't want them there. Now, the only place that kind of was tolerant at this time was the Netherlands, where the Dutch, and it makes sense because if you're the Dutch and your whole business model, your whole state, right, your government is all about making money, it's all about profits, it's all about um, investing and improving on companies and stuff like that. You're gonna want these educated Jewish people to come live there. You're going to want their expertise and their knowledge and their experience in running companies and banking systems and stuff like that. So the Netherlands, because of their mentality, because of their attitudes towards business, right, positive attitude towards business, they're going to be more tolerant, right? And a lot of Jewish people are going to flee to the Netherlands in search of, to avoid persecutions. All right, so that is it for part numero cuatro. I will see you next time for the fifth and final part of chapter 15. I know this is a long chapter. I know these videos are getting long, but thank you for watching. Thank you for learning, and I'll see you next time.